This is a Wild Games Production podcast.
Welcome to the D&D world.
Meet you by the art room door, in a circle on the hallway floor. I made up a new map last night. It's got a dragon and a wizard fight.
Be coldest open, or however you want to do it.
Have you guys ever seen the movie Prince of Persia?
No.
No? You should watch it. It's a Disney movie, so it's probably safe enough for the kids. And then it's just like a fun D&D movie.
Huh.
I remember when it came out, everyone really panned it, but then I watched it, and it was fun. Like, you know, it's got evil sorcerers, and you know, Jake Gyllenhaal's in it, and he's like a prince, but he's like a swashbuckling prince. It's good. It's like it's very Sinbad-y. You know, like there's especially the part where Jake Gyllenhaal gets up on stage and does like a full 15-minute stand-up set. That was really weird.
I'm sure this is a reference to something I do not understand.
It's the reference to the comedian Sinbad, Carl.
Oh, got it.
Millennials, am I right?
What a timely reference you just made.
But this is not the Sinbad show. I don't know where this is going. This is the Saber Die Podcast, the podcast about classic Dungeons and Dragons. I'm one of your hosts, Crispy. I seemed really unsure of that. Like, am I? I had to check in with myself.
I'm one of your hosts, Carl.
And I am one of your hosts, Courtney.
We have a special guest on our show today, author of Playing at the World, Mr. Jon Peterson.
I'm pretty sure I'm Jon Peterson. It's good. It's good.
You know, I've seen what you look like on video, and we're not doing a video call. You could just be someone doing a Jon Peterson impression.
I mean, you know, these dulcet tones are difficult to emulate.
Quick, tell us a fact about 70s LARPing that only you would know.
That a lot of it started around UCLA.
Oh.
It was wilderness tourney, and they would drive up to Malibu. There's a state park there where they would cast fireballs at each other and swing swords and set up these elaborate scenarios. And some people would play orcs and run around. And they held them, I think, like every 6 months or so. It's one of the earliest kind of boffer LARP combined with D&D phenomena. Of course, deriving ultimately from the SCA and many previous historical events. But yes, it's Jon Peterson. It really is Jon Peterson.
You ever, like, be around someone that just confirms all of your imposter syndrome? You're just like, no, I really am stupid.
John, we're so excited to have you on the show. This has been years in the making to have you back.
I think it has. I think you're right. I mean, we've been talking about this for so long, and just circumstances have conspired to keep us apart.
Yeah.
Oh, boy. All right. So, full disclosure, we did record a little bit. We lost that. So now we're treading old territory. But just because people didn't get to hear it previously, what have you guys been doing in gaming lately? I'm going to start with John. John, what have you been doing in gaming lately?
Honestly, not a lot. I mean, there's this thing going on, and, you know, we're recording this for posterity. Decades from now, people may still be listening to this. There's this COVID thing that's going around that has created a certain amount of social distancing. And I have been taking advantage of the solitude that has afforded us to catch up on a couple of video games I've been meaning to play. There's this series of Japanese games, the Persona series, and they just came out with a new version of Persona 5, and that was kind of a high priority for me. I think these are really actually important games in the evolution of JRPGs, and so and also they're like a ton of fun. So I was doing that. Before that, I was playing Death Stranding, which is really kind of the perfect COVID game, because you basically play in this post-apocalyptic world in Essential, where worker who is part of like Amazon, basically, like delivering packages around this apocalyptic wasteland. And, you got to keep a lot of social distance. When you come to deliver your packages, you talk to people's holograms. They don't come out to greet you. It's mainly been doing stuff like that. And then writing. I really write more about games than I play games overall these days. So,
Carl, what about you?
So amid all of the social distancing, I've decided to take up LARPing. Me and my kids have decided, since we have so much time to kill during our days, that we would get some Nerf boffer weapons out and hit each other with them, which has been just immensely fun. I'll set up these little scenarios. I introduce them to a wizard character that they get to interact with, and they just turned 7 and 10, so it's very immersive to them, even though it's just me in like a wizard hat with the boffer weapon.
Like one accessory will change and he's a totally different character.
Yeah.
He's a man of different hats. All his accessories are hats.
Exactly. Like I will walk around the corner, throw on a wizard hat, come back, and they'll be like, "Oh, it's the wizard!" I'll get very excited.
Love that. I'm gonna steal that for my own games. Courtney, what have you been doing? Because I know you're still working, as am I.
Yeah, I besides playing while Connor DMs,
That's gonna be a trip.
I haven't done a whole lot, but we are getting ready to start a game with some friends, so I will probably be gaming fairly regularly, like every week, going forward. Hopefully, starting Saturday. So
Nice.
but yeah, Connor's DMing right now is the maps, D&D maps. Carl can probably reference the exact product, and then he likes to get all the miniatures out, and like set them around the table or put them in the beds or whatever. Like put all the characters out, all the NPCs out. So.
Yeah, until the town is fully populated, you don't get to even know the name of it.
Yeah.
Oh wow, really?
He's got to set up his world first. Yeah,
That's adorable.
we've been using these. It's a fairly new product, Tactical Maps Reincarnated. It's just a bunch of D&D maps from various products during like 3E and 4E, and it's a nice little value of tactical maps to use for your games.
Yeah, I have the dungeon tiles reincarnated. I have not been doing any tabletop gaming except for that one game you ran for the Discord. It's the only D&D I've done. I've been playing The Witcher 3 fairly regularly after going back and actually completing The Witcher 2. So I started the game and I was like, well, I have this old save file and I'm at like the final act of the second game and I could just complete that. But like, I know what choices I'm going to make. So I just started playing and I had like anxiety about it. It was awful. I felt guilty for not continuing my first save through all 3 games. So I went back and beat The Witcher 2. It only took like 3 hours. I was right at the end. That's every waking moment when I'm not playing Animal Crossing or like watching trashy reality TV with my fiance has been that. My social distancing has actually been going pretty well. But yeah, so that's it for me. Do we want to get into today's topic, which is going to be... I'm going to let you lead on this one, Carl, because this has been your idea. And I was thinking of some stuff to say earlier, but I think because this is from your brain,
sure.
I think I'll let you take the lead. And I'm really glad to have John on the show today because even before in the previous recording that we lost a little bit of, just so amazed by his ability to just pull out factoids. It's the LARPing things that you were talking about earlier. Is that in your book? I will admit I've wanted to read it, but I have not actually bought a copy.
Well, Playing at the World has there's a number of defects in it, apart from the extravagant length. One of them is it really runs out of steam in 1977. It really doesn't try to represent anything other than kind of the birth of the role-playing game hobby and the kind of earliest efforts to turn it into a thing. So no, there's really not much about LARPing. Really, I mean, I talk about James Dallas Egbert a bit actually in the epilogue. And with that, I talk about, because there were these rumors, right? And for people who don't know the story, this is, of course, the kid famously who supposedly disappeared under the steam tunnels in 1979, around the time of Gen Con then, who turned out hadn't. He'd just like run away and he was, somewhere else and it was fine. It had nothing to do with D&D, but this is what went a long way towards making D&D a mainstream phenomenon, this panic that surrounded it. It was really the origin of the satanic panic, that moment. But there were all these press reports that kids in East Lansing, Michigan, where he was a college student, had been playing some live-action version of D&D, right? That they were down in the steam tunnels and that there were these elaborate environments they'd set up there where they'd put treasures or disgusting orc brain things made of old spaghetti and things like that. And so maybe just in that part, I talk about it a bit, but somebody needs to do this. And, I've got like a million things on my writing plate at the moment. I would love to do that story of kind of how we got from those very early LARP experiments in the 70s up to, say, Vampire. I think Vampire really crystallized for a lot of people what LARP is when it came out in the early 90s. But there's just an amazing amount of material in England and America around all that. And somebody needs to do it.
Man, we got to have you on the show more because there's like... There's more things as I talk to you. I was like, I want to pick his brain about this. I want to pick his brain about that. But yeah, let's get into the topic for today, at least. And Carl, today that is.
So when I pitched this show idea, I called it The Myth of Old School Exceptionalism because I'm incredibly pretentious. And it's this idea that I see kind of permeate discussions about what is and is not old school D&D. I think it's almost always put up as this sort of like isolated experience. There is a universal game that we all played until 1999 when it all changed, and then there were multiple kinds of games of D&D out there. But before that, it was this sort of monolithic identity of what D&D was, and I'm resistant to that idea. My limited experience, I started playing D&D in 1992, but I don't feel like our game was kind of any more the status quo than any other table. And I think what sort of happens is people look at their own table or their own experience and think of that on a broader scale. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, one, these concepts of like what is the old school D&D experience and how varied that actually was.
And this sounded great to me because there was no way that the myth of old school exceptionalism could be controversial in any way. You wouldn't be getting any angry letters having a show about that. And so I said, I'm in. I know that this could only go well.
Yeah, we did discuss a little bit about how this could be a controversial topic. So I guess up front, we want to say the views and opinions of everyone here are their own and do not represent Save or Die or Wild Games Productions. So we're all on our own.
But send us your emails.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Whatever it is.
Questions at saveordie.info.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, I guess I was going to say to start that, I think... Yeah, the myth in some respects, I mean, it's funny that you mentioned 1999. And I think a lot of people do see a break around the time that Forge stuff started coming out, let's be honest, right? There was this kind of interest in RPG theory then and kind of looking at RPGs. So it's something that should be criticized the way that other forms of art are criticized and products should be made along those lines. And, one of the foundational texts of that movement, right, was Ron Edwards's A Hard Look at Dungeons and Dragons, which is, it's largely a kind of what I remember back in the day that Ron Edwards wrote. But it's very much about the incredible diversity of the early experience and about how, he anecdotally recalls, there would be gaming groups that would have, a couple issues of the Dragon, like a copy of the Monster Manual, like the third book of one of the white box sets, and a bunch of house rules. And anywhere you went, it was just completely different.
That's literally how I got started. But that was in 2002.
That's pretty good. And obviously that was true. I mean, obviously, different people had access to different things. And when we talk about old school, we can talk about it in a couple different ways. Like I said, Playing at the World runs out of steam around 1977. And that initial period, before people called it a role-playing game, even before people had the idea that there was this kind of emerging movement that had a bunch of different components to it and different people playing. I mean, you can look through the microscope at like that era in its incredible diversity, which was, grounded in, let's face it, the fact that D&D was, as one guy put it in 1975, it was more of like an outline of a game than a game, right? It was, a set of rules, but it didn't really give you much instruction on what you were supposed to do with them, on like the moment-to-moment play of the game. You could tell you how to, resolve a combat, kinda. I mean, this is something that was a source of endless confusion, and spell memorization, the subject of endless confusion. So, I mean, even in that very early period, there was necessarily a lot of diversity because the guidelines of D&D just left people a lot of work to do. And then, you get into how diverse it became once other voices started to really have an influence on the community. And, you can look at a product like Superhero 44, right? This guy who was running a D&D campaign, who at one point opened a portal that went to, a superhero world, right? And his players went through it and started interacting with like Dr. Octopus and things like that. And they started making rules for what it would be to be a superhero in that environment. And just seamlessly, his game transitioned from a medieval fantasy D&D game into ostensibly the first published superhero system. So, yeah, I mean, there was an incredible diversity of activities around this from the start. And as more creative people engaged with the game and started putting things out about it, it led to this just incredible cultural movement.
It's so interesting to say that, old school D&D as it was played in the 70s and 80s is a monolith, when the only thing that I think is monolithic about old school D&D is that every table was different. So I do think there is something to be said, like Carl has said, that everyone is extrapolating their own anecdotal experience into being like, this is how it was for everyone, when it wasn't. So much so that, like if you look at Gary's attitudes for Dungeons and Dragons and like help columns and things like that, I think largely the takeaway up until AD&D, I might be mistaken. I'm not a cool like archivist like John, so I might get some stuff wrong. That's why he's here. Up until like AD&D, his answer was, well, it's your game. Like, figure it out. Like, what do you think would be cool? And to the point where, then he published the quote unquote definitive edition in AD&D, and it became, no, these are the rules. This is how it is.
And yeah, that was a transitional moment for the community. There's no doubt about it. I mean, I can remember a piece that a guy named Scott Rosenberg, who was editor of a zine called The Cosmic Balance, wrote when he heard that there was going to be a basic D&D and an advanced D&D, where he was like, it's over. Like, the entire community we built is over, because now all the things that we got to choose for ourselves are going to be in cold, hard type. And, it's going to lead to this wave of conformism. I mean, it's like any underground phenomenon, right, to some respect, where the early adopters, the people who were into grunge before Nirvana got big, oh, now everybody loves it. Oh, my God, everything's over. It's all sold out in commercial. There's a certain amount of that to it. But, I think maybe Scott at the time didn't have enough faith in the fact that even if you print it in cold, hard type, like, people are still, when you're just sitting around the table with your friends and playing, like, the collaborative creative process that takes place is something that can't be removed by over-specification. It's always going to be there, and it's always going to be transformative, and it's always going to be you engaging with what is going to work for the people you're playing with.
I think I do understand where Scott was coming from, though, because even today, I I started playing D&D when it was almost 35 years old. And I've been playing for more than half my life. And still to this day, I just think to myself, I really wish D&D was uncool again so that other people didn't have it and it didn't have the same authority that I would have. Like I get that reactionary. Like I get where he's coming from. I mean, D&D is cool again for the first time. But like I don't know. I think it is a very reactionary stance to take. But ultimately, like as you said, other people playing it a different way doesn't take away from the way you're playing it, which is, I think, ultimately like the biggest strength of D&D.
No, I agree. I mean, it's only the people sitting around the table with you that have to like the way you're doing it, and like you tell the story that you find compelling, and and I mean, obviously, there is, when we look at that period when AD&D came out, this is a time when, because of that whole James Dallas Egbert stuff, there was this mass influx of new players, and a lot of them were young. This was a point when the demographics of D&D shifted from kind of high school, college, down to like middle school, like point where, 2/3 of the product they were selling was, bought by or for people between 10 and 14 years old. And those people, maybe didn't engage with the game the same way that a college student would engage with the game. And so there was this kind of tiered, at least perception in the community that, they called the munchkins, right? That this is a term that really came from this era, the munchkin hordes who would descend on these games and at conventions or at local clubs, and older and more mature players couldn't reconcile themselves to their play style. And so, those people really did cut a path that was very different from playing by the book. And there was much more, I guess, playing by the book that was kind of instilled in these poor kids when, the Dragon went out to 100,000 subscribers. And that was what like everybody read and everybody trusted.
Mm-hmm. I do firmly believe that older versions of D&D are played a different way than I would play, say, Pathfinder or 5th edition. And I know Carl doesn't agree with that, which is why we're doing this show.
I think one of the things about the OSR is that we're either trying to recreate an experience of our own past, or of a past we didn't know anything about, or was not involved in. I mean, the version of D&D that I prefer to play came out before I was born. So I'm sort of reaching back through time and finding this version that is, to me, there's a sense of idealism around it. I guess I feel like there's two camps. There's that we commonly talk about, and that is story games versus simulationist games. These are the two camps we put kind of most role-playing games into. And I think that wording is wrong, because I think all of these games tell a story. And my issue with those wordings, and my issue with this concept of like story game is somehow a new concept, is because when you read the OD&D books from 1974, Gary Gygax in his foreword tells you nothing except about stories. Like, if you like these books, play this game. So it was always sort of framed as this sort of story generator. And I think you can see that also in the games that came out right after D&D. If it wasn't fantasy, then it was horror, or it was superheroes, or it was science fiction. And if it were not a story generating game, we would see games that came out, like City Builder, or Manage a Hospital, or, Manage a Police Precinct. Those would all be exciting scenarios to take effect in, but they're not necessarily dramatic narratives that we're drawn to.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. And we could spend a whole hour just on this question of the story simulation. And of course, there are a bunch of permutations, this model. The one that was kind of the first popular one among role players was Glenn Blacow's model, right? Which separated, he identified these forms that he believed would be exemplified by different D&D games. There was a wargaming forum, which included all that kind of simulation stuff. There was a role-playing forum, which was really focused on kind of the players and them experiencing their characters. There was a storytelling forum, which was focused on there being some kind of overarching narrative, usually one governed by the referee, by the dungeon master, not exclusively. He admitted of a couple different varieties of how that could play out. And then, of course, the power gaming forum, this idea that you're really just there for wish fulfillment to make the biggest badass and to kill the most orcs or whatever. And what Glenn's great insight was, and at the time, people really recognized this as a great insight when he wrote a famous article about it in 1980, you could find in Different Worlds, is that when you were looking at those munchkins, right, when people are trying to figure out why can't we play with these kids who are doing AD&D, Glenn acknowledged when most people started, they really were kind of power gaming and he even suggests that the OD&D rules, because of the experience system itself, because of the way progression is presented as the ostensible objective of the game, that was going to steer you in a power gaming kind of direction. And they saw a maturity process by which people got more interested in the role-playing dimension and the storytelling dimension. Most people really didn't like the simulation dimension of it. You kind of hear people play that down a bit, but you hear voices advocating for it as well, suggesting that the wargaming component of D&D, it was still a very substantial part of the experience. And, Pathfinder and 4E and things that are very focused on those kind of tactical miniatures battles, I think substantiate what the appetite is among some kind of players for that. And so, yeah, I mean, that diversity of opinion about what the right way was to approach the game, Glenn was probably the first person who really articulated that as a philosophical model. But that idea that there were these kind of different incentives or different creative agendas, if you will, that people brought to these games, it went back to the wargaming community. I can show you things from 1971, where there are wargamers saying, man, I'm a fun mainstream wargamer. And then there's these people who just play to be competitive, or those are bad guys. And there's people who are just too focused on simulation, and they're bad guys too. And, there's this mainstream of fun, though, that I belong to. And so even before D&D came out, people already saw those divisions in the community and created those kinds of typologies to pigeonhole things that weren't quite the way they wanted to play.
The biggest difference, I think, for me, for an old school game versus a newer version, I guess contemporary Dungeons and Dragons. I hate saying new school or modern. I want to coin a new term, which is contemporary Dungeons and Dragons, and that's anything that's not OSR D&D. So everyone go out on Reddit and the OD&D 74 boards, start spreading that out there for me and just credit me so I get the cool credit. But for me, the biggest disconnect between those two play styles is actually rolling dice for everything. In my head, I equate, just what do you want to do? Blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, that succeeds. To me, that's very much a facet of old school D&D. Whereas in contemporary D&D, it's a role for everything. And I'm not alone in this. I've played with a lot of different people who are around my same age, who never had that experience of playing old school D&D, who have only played contemporary Dungeons and Dragons. And we all sort of have that same understanding of this is how you play Dungeons and Dragons. But just recently, I was rereading through 3.5 because I got bit by a nostalgia bug. And the rules encourage you to take 10 and take 20, which are the rules, the codified rules for things automatically succeeding. And I don't know why. I think it was because you had a new demographic of a new generation of munchkins who didn't have the previous exposure to the way D&D may have been played going into this, who just picked up the rules and were maybe of a slightly younger age increment, that high school, middle school age. And we all decided rolling dice is fun, and that's what we want to do.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you go back to D&D 1974, there's not a lot you can actually roll for. And it's really unclear even if you're supposed to be able to roll for anything. I mean, when you get back to the very original rules, should the referee be rolling? Should you be rolling? Should you even have that sense of engagement? That agency was something that the fan community kind of agonized over, like what the right approach to that was. But if you really look at the rules, I mean, there's no like perception checks, there's no passive wisdom, there's no search, there's no like all the things that we think you should just naturally have a die roll for. You didn't have dice rolls for. You had a die roll for, can I open this door on a 1 or a 2? You had a roll for listening at doors. But, until the thief rules came out, and, they obviously existed in draft form in 74, but then Greyhawk in 75 brought them to the mainstream audience. I mean, that was the first place where there's really a concept of like skills, right? I mean, there's a bit of skill in Empire of the Petal Throne. There's professions, and you could make things with your professions and things like that. But it was really this broadening of the scope of resolution is one of the main things that actually changed a lot about these games in the first 5 years or so. By the time you get to BRP, to KSM's basic role-playing, the engine underneath RuneQuest, and then subsequently Call of Cthulhu and everything else, BRP has a much broader sense of what are resolvable actions. And these were rooted largely in the Perrin conventions, right? And Steve Perrin's house rules for D&D in the Bay Area that kind of ended up getting backdoored into RuneQuest as he went forward. And the Perrin conventions is one of the first places I can point to that introduced like an arbitrary kind of dex check. Like, okay, if you want to do some acrobatic feat, well, here's a thing you can roll that will resolve that. And that was a huge shift. And yes, when I play 5e is incredibly crunchy. I mean, there's rolls for like everything. And, I'm not sure I would necessarily lay the blame at Jonathan Tweet's feet for that. I mean, I think 3 brought in a lot of really cool RP-ish concepts from Ars Magica and other stuff that Jonathan was working on at the time. But Second Ed had that kind of you can roll for most sorts of things. So I mean, yeah, there was definitely an evolution in this, and I think that evolution was pushed by a lot of things other than D&D during the old school era. And BRP with its just concept of statements of intention and kind of how they get resolved. This idea that you don't even have to roll unless there's a conflict, either a conflict with another player or a conflict with the environment. That's when the dice come into play. I think that was really the road that led us down to where 3E is.
Yeah, but so I was originally going to disagree with something you were asserting until you qualified it with the thief rules. Because when you look at the things that there are rules and skills and things like that covered in 3E, they are almost one-to-one corollaries to the things that you would roll for, or the certain procedures you would find in the exploration phase of classic D&D. And it's so funny that you brought up Jonathan Tweet and RuneQuest, because I remember reading once upon a time a critique of 3.5 of someone stating that, Jonathan Tweet really wanted to make the new version of Quest, and he did that but disguised it as Dungeons and Dragons with the D20 system. So like the things that you're doing and rolling for they're not really that different from what you would see a roll called for in classic Dungeons and Dragons. And I don't know where the disconnect is coming from, but well,
I mean, I think it's around classic there, right? I mean, if you're talking about Dungeons and Dragons before 1976, I would disagree. I don't think there are rules for most things that you would try to roll for. I mean, again, there's things like perception, right, are like not generic character abilities.
That would be so things like perception, if you break it out into spot, search, all those things, that would be your I guess we could take it a little further than the original rule set, but that's going to correlate to, your D6 rule to search a room for traps, or your listen at doors roll, right? So those things they changed the names and filed down the serial numbers, but it's still the same things. But even kind of going back to your earlier statements, specifically with RuneQuest, the game's rules as written, 3.0 and 3.5 specifically, state that you should really only be rolling under duress. Like if someone's not trying to mess with you while you're trying to climb up a wall, or if it's not exceedingly difficult, or listen at a door or pick a lock, like you should be taking 10 or taking 20 to just automatically succeed. And I don't know where there's a generation of gamers, in my opinion, who sort of just all missed that paragraph.
When I did the D&D Next playtest in whatever that was, 2012. Yeah, I remember the first thing they did when I sat down with my GM was they said, okay, they picked somebody at my table and said, get up from your chair, like walk around the table and sit back down. And the person does that. And the DM said, okay, anything you want to do that is you could do as easily as that, you can just do it. There are no rules.
Mm-hmm. That was one of my favorite things about the D&D Next test was them bringing back auto success and just making it a much more prominent function of the rule set, and it was great during the playtest. I still find that for some reason, people have come in new to 5th edition, still are requiring you to roll for everything.
I think there's two ways that people talk about old school gaming, and I think that's in rules and in play style. And I think one of the things that did change in 2000, even if the rules have a lot of similarities, there's less similarities between 3.0 and 2E than there is between 2E and OD&D. The OD&D is closer to 2E than 2E is closer to 3E. There's 25 years where D&D was pretty much the same rule set. And what I am interested in is this concept of how much does that rule set dictate the play style? Or is the play style easily separated from the rule set? And are there people who are playing 3E, 4E, and 5E in what we consider an old school style? Because of course there are. And how common was it to play in the 70s and 80s in what we now consider this new school style? And so I think one of the things that 3E does that kind of refocuses us into this kind of new school style where we're kind of relying on the character's abilities instead of the player's abilities. I think that's a big separation between these play styles, is that it presents the rules in a way that is, one, very streamlined, which means that now the thief isn't the only one that on their character sheet has these hide opportunities and these sneaking opportunities. It's every character. So that communicates to the person at the table, well, I have this list of abilities. I should use them.
Yeah, and I always think of Symbolist, of Ed Symbolist, the designer, co-designer of Chivalry and Sorcery, when we get to this discussion, because Symbolist was one of the first people who looked at D&D and said, people all the time tell me that they've played these amazing campaigns with D&D with amazing stories and everything. And he said, yeah, but if you look at the rules themselves, the rules are really just about dungeon exploration. There's like nothing in there about role playing. There's nothing in there about anything other than kind of this life of this murder hobo life. And he made the argument quite forcefully in 78 and 79 that the system of a game limits everything that it's possible to do with the game, and that the fact that D&D failed to specify to a sufficient degree what you do with your downtime, right, was what started to inspire him to write Chivalry and Sorcery, to look at a broader simulation of what a medieval world would look like. And, in retrospect, of course, when we look at Chivalry and Sorcery, which is an incredibly complicated game with like all these like horrible simulation-y, wargamey things in it, there's this great irony that Symbolists would advocate so passionately for like the emptiness of OD&D compared to it. But, this became a common talking point in the late 70s and early 1980s about D&D and about, there were people who really did just want to kind of look at it like it was a war game. Because anything you did that made it more than a war game is something you did. It wasn't built in. And this goes back to that idea that D&D is just an outline of a game, and it's kind of up to the referee and the people around the table to figure out what they want to do with it, to build enough system and material into it to make it into what they want it to be. And, when I think of what the oldest school D&D is, if you ask me what is old school, old school for me is that period. It's that period of that incredible freedom and the creativity that freedom unleashed in people, which led to this incredible diversity of play styles, of people that were focused on stories, people that were focused on power gaming. Later system, the more you specify, I guess, this is what this ultimately comes down to, the more things you tell people how to resolve, the more the system fills in what it is to do a particular action, the more that does guide them, right, into particular kind of conduits of play.
Right, and I don't think it's impossible to break away from that, but I do think it presents the challenge of breaking away from it, where when there's less structure, it presents this challenge of filling it in. It's sort of the reverse.
Right.
That's so interesting. I don't think people have ever stopped doing that.
Of course, even Gary Gygax didn't stop doing that. I mean, if you read the D&D, the Dungeon Master's Guide, there's all these escape valves. He's like, oh, this is the absolute lockdown system, and yet he says all the time, feel free to fudge die rolls and feel free to arbitrarily change events if you really want to. If that's what serves the direction you want to take the campaign, just do it. And of course, everybody just did whatever they wanted.
Even with, I'll take Pathfinder for an example. I don't know. I find that the more. My take is that the more rules there are to dislike. The more these rules get codified, the more I'm encouraged to throw them out and come up with my own simplified homebrew solution.
Well, yeah, when you hear Ed Symbolist talk about this too, or Gygax, I mean, it's always important to remember that, Symbolist was speaking from a position of advocating for a new game system competing with D&D, and so he felt like there was a need, just as to differentiate, right, what he was doing and why you should buy CNS instead of AD&D. And similarly, Gary Gygax, right, he was confronted with this immense diversity of the playstyles of the 1970s, and it's kind of hard to target products to groups that have in fact turned their D&D game into a superhero game, right? And so being able to say, okay, there's going to be different play my style, you should play it like this. There is necessarily this commercial dimension behind it, and what modules you write and so on are going to be dependent upon that. And so, but I fundamentally agree with you that nothing is going to sap the spirit. I mean, to some degree, you can say the more rules there are, the less people have to think for themselves, or or you could say the more rules there are, the more people are going to rebel against them. People are gonna find a way to have the experience they want to have around the tabletop. But I mean, I guess that line of inquiry isn't terribly profitable for me in understanding what differentiates the old school systems from the later systems, which, and especially if we get into what a story game, say, is, which I think Carl brought up earlier. Like when I look at things like Powered by the Apocalypse, I think there is a real difference between what these games are doing and what D&D does.
I wonder if the popularity of World of Darkness during that same time period sort of lit a fire under OSR, because it's impossible for these things not to bleed into each other. And World of Darkness is a very narrative-driven play experience. And I imagine that probably bled into a couple of 2E and 3E D&D games. And I wonder if this kind of staunch, no, the old school play style is you go in the dungeon and you check for traps, and that's you're all dungeon bound, and that's the game, and this is what the old school experience is, wasn't a push back necessarily against the 3E play style, but of kind of the popular narrative based games of that time.
Yeah, I'm sure there's something to that. I mean, I don't know really how narrative Vampire is. I mean, to me, Vampire really is still a superhero game. I mean, there are rules for how you're supposed to lose your humanity if you butcher humans, but I think people treated them a lot like people treated encumbrance in, old school D&D, where it was kind of a nuisance that most of the time could get swept under the table. Certainly, I think there were people by the 2000s who definitely felt that going back and trying to restore the original experience was going to reveal something. And part of that is, I think, just historical interest, right? I mean, it was only really apparent with a few decades of retrospect just how important those original concepts were. I mean, when Diablo is out, and Baldur's Gate is out. Games that are outselling what the player's handbook was outselling by like 10x, right? People are having access to that dungeon experience and are interested in what just historically motivated this. And that need as well to get back to something that's more artisanal, I guess, to be able to approach that same experience, but on your own terms, not as a kind of mass market product where the overall narrative is pushed down on you, but instead you and your friends get to decide what the story is going to be, which you can't really do in Diablo. I think that was a big push for that as well. The kids were just raised, even beyond the kids who grew up with AT&D, the kids who grew up with Baldur's Gate and Diablo, they, I think, went back for something that was more primal.
You've mentioned Powered by the Apocalypse. This is not a system I have a lot of firsthand experience with, but I know it's a system that kind of allows this sort of control of the narrative. And when I think of these terms of like story game versus simulations game, the reason I push back against that is because, I have tons of stories from old school D&D play that are really immensely interesting, in my opinion, or at least immensely interesting to me at the time. And I think when I hear that, oh, that's not a story game, this is a story game, what we're actually talking about is how much control the players at the table have over the story, as far as like narrative mechanics, or when we kind of observe the story as a table as something we can move around and change the structure of the story when we have narrative mechanics. To me, I only want mechanics to represent physics. I only want to represent the physical actions and the things that can happen within the game. But the game is still a story-based game, a game of narrative construction. It's just the thing that changes is how much control over that construction is given to the mechanics of it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I always look back to Top Secret, to fame and fortune points when I look at fate points or any of the inspiration points that we have in 5th edition. Mechanics you give to players to grant them explicit narrative control. Even earlier than fate points and fortune points, because they were really fame points and fortune, they were a substitute for saving throws. Like when Gary talks about what saving throws actually meant, right? He talks about them in story mechanics terms. There's this, I think it's in the DMG, he has this whole kind of screed about what it is to make a saving throw. And he's like, look, in a story about a hero, like a Conan, there's this opportunity for you to just escape death, escape this horrible consequence. No matter what the physics are, it has nothing to do with the physics. It has to do with the fact that you're Conan. And, Top Secret took that further. It's like, if you have fame points, if you're James Bond, you're just too famous to be killed by that low-level thug who happened to shoot you. And so you can spend a fame point to say, no, actually, I didn't get killed here. And there are a whole bunch of corollaries for these that you see even in games in the 1970s that have cast a very long shadow over that whole kind of narrative control discussion. But I mean, the thing about Apocalypse that I think is different, it's not just awarding narrative control. It's much more, the creative impetus behind the story itself is pushed at game creation to the players. The players have to kind of make the environment they come from and create hooks, and the dungeon master has very limited powers in some ways to steer how the player is going to come into contact and what the resulting story of this will be. And when you read somebody like Tweet talking about his goals for Ars Magica in the late 80s, I mean, he talks a lot about how could you just get a bunch of people together and have them all create jointly an interesting, spontaneous story. One that doesn't require that, what Blacow would have called the storyteller or overarching narrative being controlled by a referee, where the referee really can just change reality arbitrarily if they need to make the narrative that they're trying to achieve come true. These games like Apocalypse, and whether they succeed or fail is an entirely different subject, their design goal is to flip that on its head and to instead create this world where the players are the ones who are really responsible for the narrative, and the DM has a very mechanical, almost clerical role in the way that Apocalypse games can be played.
It's so interesting you say that, because I think that ultimately is how I view an old school referee is in that exact sort of vein. It's someone who is not driving the story. That the story it's actually be driven by what the players want to do. Them going and trying to find the treasure and try to earn rewards to become more powerful to eventually, make your own kingdom or wizard's tower or whatever it is. And in my experience, in playing any form of Dungeons and Dragons, players have always been really, I guess maybe because there's some kind of stigma about how a D&D game should be played, that players have always been very resistant to that sort of play. In my head, the main difference between old school D&D and contemporary D&D, I'm going to make that stick, I promise, is that in an old school game, the DM is the referee, is the judge. And, you interact with the world in some way and he tells you the results of that. So it is sort of like he's the actuary of reality. Whereas in contemporary D&D, I think this starts in 2nd edition. I actually have coined it as the Hickman effect. If you look at the change in modules between what TSR was publishing in like the pre-Ravenloft days, essentially, there isn't a story, or there is kind of a hint at one. Whereas when Hickman came in with Ravenloft and Dragonlance, modules became narrative focused, and I think the game became narrative focused. So for me, that's the difference between old school and new school play.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I go back to the fundamentals. If you really look at D&D in 74, I mean, it tells you it's your job as the referee to sit down and create the world, to generate the dungeons, to create the environment the players are going to interact with. And certainly you can find people who advocated in the 70s for a view that, the function of the referee, the way these games are structured, players would kind of explore the referee's creativity in the generation of that environment. And I think that's a valid view of it. I mean, I think the closer you get back to the wargaming roots, obviously players have a tremendous amount of agency in war games. They really are in charge of what's going to happen, in charge of the fate of their characters. A lot of what people pushed back against was this notion, that referees could change the world arbitrarily. In other words, like if you try, you tell the referee, I open the door, and the referee says, you can't, when the door doesn't open. Like the fact that you don't know why, well, okay, I try to pick the lock, and the referee rolls behind the counter. Well, it doesn't work. That agency depriving feeling that generated, caused this backlash of people who wanted to be able to have more explicit controls over how their players interact with the environment, so they could see that they had any control over anything, right? Mm-hmm. And the OD&D rules do lend themselves to being a pure Kriegspiel, where you really do just say, this is what I'm trying to do, and you don't need to know anything about the system to ask these questions, right? The referee can just answer you and say, well, this is what happens. And the question of why that happened sometimes is something your character at least shouldn't know. And, that's been, I think, maybe the fundamental tension. If I just point to any single fundamental tension in the design of RPGs over the last 50 years now, it's been how you balance that, how you balance, this quality immersion that people talk about, the sense they want to be able to feel like they're in their character's situation, which is, kind of in an uneasy alliance with this idea that you really have any idea why anything happens to you in these games, that you understand the system well enough to be able to be able to predict what should work and what shouldn't, and understand the world well enough to predict those things. And yeah, I mean, that tension has played out in so many different ways. And certainly I do agree with you as well about the increasing narrative sophistication of the environments that were being sold as commercial products, especially. And from Empire of the Petal Throne on, right, there were fully articulated worlds with histories and, real story situations that you were thrust into. And that too is very different in some respects from what was in the original game.
Yeah, when we look at B1 or B2, and we look at these modules, it really just gives you an environment. And then when we look at a gazetteer, for example, it's really giving you a narrative to follow. that's their kind of adventure seed that they provide you in there, and it's really about what's going to happen next and not where things are.
Yeah, and Gary would, push back. I remember there's a Dragon article when I think it was called "Books Are Books and Games Are Games, Never the Twain Shall Meet," which he talked about why LOTR would make for a lousy game. That is LOTR, the story would, because it's such a railroad, right? Because a story where Sauron wins isn't a satisfying story, and he saw this kind of vast gulf between a too closely articulated narrative path. He liked the sandbox, but not so much the narrative path through these things. And many people, including Tracy Hickman, really were looking at this from a very different perspective.
Mm-hmm. We haven't heard from Courtney in the last hour. Courtney, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm not. I'm loving listening to everything. I'm not big into history, so I don't really have a whole lot of comments or questions. But I am loving hearing you guys talk about it. So,
I don't know if we're any closer to an answer, though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're be starting this card. So, what's our consensus going to be coming out of this?
I don't even know if we've even stayed on a single subject long enough to have a consensus. One of the goals in my mind was to kind of talk about the different ways that old school D&D was played, and that's still left pretty unanswered. Because they're infinite, so it's hard to pin down. But I know in these conversations I have with people, there are people who consider miniatures to be a very new school approach to the game. Like, oh, miniatures, those didn't show up till 3rd edition, which is clearly untrue.
False.
But I mean, what they're doing is they're looking at the way that they saw it played, and they're extrapolating data from that. I also know people who kind of feel like if there aren't miniatures at the table, this does not feel like an old school game to me. So I've heard both of those sides, and it's just one of those things that I think one of the reasons the OSR kind of resists definition is because there's so many different approaches to these old school games and what even counts as an old school game or not.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a tough one, right? Because of that immense diversity. So a lot of people say, and if you read the original D&D rule books, Gygax kind of suggests miniatures are nice to look at, but hardly essential for playing the game. Mm-hmm. But then look at, the Rith campaign, the Rith Chronicles, right? One of the earliest well-documented campaigns out there. Look at the New York activities and Haven Herald and so on. People had rules for how to play tactical combats with miniatures that were specified in these things by 1975, because the combat system in D&D was insufficiently specified for the kind of combats they wanted to run. And so they built their battle grids, and they built okay, you can move this way, and this is how many steps it is to do this in combat and how many steps to do that. And there wasn't the material there to support that. So it was, created by the community. But there's no question that a lot of people came to that same conclusion, that they needed those rules, and they just made them and published them, and they were out there.
I think one thing that might be helpful is to see where we all fall on the answer to old school exceptionalism, which I guess the question would be, do you think that old school D&D is played in a different manner than contemporary D&D?
I mean, I think this goes back immediately to what I was saying about Ron Edwards and a hard look at D&D in the beginning. It's impossible to look at D&D, the phenomenon, as it was received by the players and say, this was the way it was played. Some people played it like improvisational theater, like pure Kriegspiel. There were in 1975, I can show you people saying they're not going to let their players know the rules. And other people played it like a war game. I actually, up on my blog, I have a couple of old news clips. And there's one news clip from 1976 that's from a DC area hobby store where, the referee was literally not playing the opposition. You had players against players was the game, and the referee really was a neutral arbiter. And honestly, I think Dave Arneson gravitated much more to that play style than he did to kind of I'm the dark force puppeteering all of the monsters in the dungeon. He preferred something where it was really the players who were going to be conflicting among each other, and he kind of got to sit back and just adjudicate between them. But I mean, these all existed simultaneously, and so I mean, it's almost impossible to codify what was the old school way.
But do you think that those ways are vastly different from how people are playing modern D&D?
Well, I think some of them are very different, and some of them probably aren't. I mean, I was just in a D&D game earlier this year that was a complete dungeon smash and grab, right? Where we were playing Mad Mage. We're playing Mad Mage the module. And it was a total power game slaughterfest, right? And like some tables you sit down to, I mean, it was played with miniatures, played very, tactically on a grid. I think that might not have been very different from what some people were doing in 1975.
Yeah, I think the rules are different. And I think while that does sort of lead people different directions, I do think that the play styles have existed forever. Even during the creation of the game, I imagine there was times that they sat down and tried it one way and then tried it the other, or, and maybe it wasn't as sophisticated as that, or maybe they didn't even realize they were doing it. I've had sessions where kind of coming out of it, people go, man, we didn't roll a single die during that entire session.
Those are my favorite sessions.
Well, and then some people, when it was said to me, it was not said in a, ooh, that was great. But the point being, and kind of the reason I want to talk about this idea is I feel like the OSR as a whole is sort of looking for this play style. And I think part of that is in reaction to what they perceive as a play style that has taken over the way D&D is played. And when we talk about the current play style of D&D, what we're really talking about is one where people envision their characters, both their backstory and their story going forward. And
it's my least favorite thing.
And they're thinking of it as narrative construction. And maybe it's, instead of story gaming, we should call it authorship gaming. We should talk about it as like, what role in the game do you have as an author? How much of the story are you authoring as a player?
And, if I went back to Symbolist, right? Once again, Symbolist was a real believer in plotting the fate of his characters, and of having, the referee's responsibility. And this is, again, writing 1978-ish, having the referee's responsibility be to realize the narrative, the word, the kismet, whatever it was of his character. And he gives this great example of that, and of kind of different ways that if his character would have died without receiving his fate, the referee should fail forward him. And but this was part of the dialogue, even in 1978. I mean, that's the thing that's really, so
because failing forward is a game tenet that I learned from Luke Crane's Burning Wheel system, and it's something that I do bring into my D&D games. And to me, that's been something that I thought was sort of like, oh, that kind of like, that's my little niche. That's like the thing that makes me a cool DM, is I do this for them. But some bozo back in 1978 was doing it. So nothing's original, I guess.
Well, I mean, that's part of it. But that is the thing for me that is so exceptional about the OSR, right? Or the old school play style, separate from how we recreate it. Like this diversity and this creativity that was like unleashed by the release of D&D took people in such a multitude of directions. And if you look back to the dawn of like the wargaming hobby in 1957, when Jack Scrooby started the Wargame Digest, it went until 62 into 63 maybe. But like in that time period, pretty much people exhausted what the design space was of miniature wargaming. They thought of most of the kinds of things you'd want to be able to do with it. And similarly, I think that was largely true of RPGs. I mean, people came up with a lot of the core ideas. Now, I mean, I don't think they came up with literally everything. And I do think some of these games, like the Apocalypse stuff, really are, or Jason Morningstar stuff, right? Fiasco, Grey Ranks, games like that. Like, you wouldn't really be able to find Grey Ranks in, like, 1978. But they did think through kind of what the implications were of the referee having this degree of narrative control, what it meant for these things to be stories. People were profoundly concerned with the storytelling dimension of this from the very start, and how you can generate immersion from it and things like it.
I do think there is something to be said for the difference in contemporary D&D's rule sets versus an old school D&D rule set. Like, one of the things that I miss a lot when I'm looking at 5e are things like the dungeon turn, and sort of having a procedure for the group, a real world procedure of everyone giving what they want to do to a centralized party leader. That's something that I don't think exists in modern D&D. Time in a dungeon is not structured. Exploration in a dungeon is not structured. It does become more of a, for some reason, that portion of it is free for all, where the exploration rules in D&D, while I will not say are like explicitly designed to cover all instances, they're at least touched upon. How fast you can move, and things like how long something takes, and you can, and when wandering monsters show up. That's not really codified as much in post second edition D&D. Same thing with like hirelings. Like getting a troop of guys together to go pull a heist at the Dragon King's tomb. I feel like that sort of play style is less in focus with today's rule sets, unless that's what the DM says you're gonna do.
I'll certainly. I think I got your back on that one. I mean, I was thinking of Ars Magica, of course, and like the Custos mechanisms, and this idea of kind of troop style play, and you've got the wizard, and then kind of a supporting cast, and you switch it around. I mean, certainly there are games that have experimented a lot with what it's like to have that experience of command. That the time management thing, I think I largely agree with you. I mean, like encumbrance, I think it just is something that people, tried to streamline, right, to make it chafe less in the player's experience.
Well, I imagine that like when they were getting playtest feedback as much as they could for the newer versions of D&D, like one of the things that people probably said was, yeah, we don't really use dungeon turns, or we don't use the caller or the mapper. And so those real world positions sort of just got axed because people weren't really using them. But I think they are a really special portion of, I think, the feel, like the aesthetic feel of an old school D&D game. Sort of how the art.
I've still done mapping, at least in 5e.
So where I was at on this is that the rules have changed, but that's pretty much it. Because D&D has always been a game of infinite possibilities. So that's kind of where I was trying to land with what I was saying earlier. So while 5e's rules do not look very much like OD&D's rules, you can do these wildly disparate games, both within only using 5e and with only using old school D&D. So that's why I'm resistant to this, like, there's an old school play style. I'm resistant to that idea because I think the play styles, the possibilities have always been endless, because that's what originally fascinated people with D&D in the first place. Mm-hmm. I feel like the reason there's such a fascination around it.
Games and Six Guns and Sorcery, to steal a term from Gary. Cowboys going back in time to Arthurian times. Like, and I agree with you, Carl. Like, that was sort of what I was saying about third edition, is if you look at the rules, the things that there are rules for really haven't changed. They changed the labels, but your listen check is still it's still the listen at doors check, and the spot check is still the surprise roll. Like, I don't think you're wrong in this regard.
I mean, certainly, I think 3E was radical just in having like armor class, like
go up instead of down.
Yeah, which Zeb Cook said was something they couldn't do in second ed, right? That people just they wouldn't take it. And yeah, the D20 system having the one roll to rule them all did give them a lot of opportunities to make what seemed at the time, sure, like profound, very difficult changes. But yeah, in retrospect, how much effect some of them had is probably a bigger question.
Yeah,
I actually don't like single resolution mechanics. I like the game aspect of D&D, where I use all D6 damage dice in my BX game, because it's like, oh, now I'm gonna roll the game dice. I'm playing a game. Now I'm gonna roll the game dice, or I'm gonna roll this weird die, and I think that's a fun portion of it. So I lament the loss of all those different fiddly rules.
I think this ascending versus descending armor class is one of the strangest things to permeate our RPG culture, because it's one of those mechanics that's only different in its presentation. You can look at mechanics in old school D&D and go, wow, that's really different. But whether your armor class is 2 or 18 is not one of them. That functions exactly the same.
Yeah. Also, it's just like when people are like descending armor class, like I never got my head around it. I was like, you can't, or Thaco, I guess specifically. My thought always is, do you not know how to subtract? Did you not go to that day of first grade? Did you just miss that whole unit?
I was going to say, I mean, there are limits, I think they discovered when they're doing 3E to how far they could bend D&D and still have it be D&D.
Mm-hmm.
Like, 3E is almost classless, right? Mm-hmm. Like, because you can be like, oh, I'm going to take a level of fighter, and now I'm going to take a level of bard. And you just kind of, every time you level up, you can just kind of pick from this menu, and you get, the base class feats for everyone. And, there are certain levels you want to reach for these before you move on to the next. And it retains class while being as classless as it can be. Mm-hmm. But there was a line they didn't feel like they could cross, right? It couldn't be a classless game. I mean, RuneQuest is basically a classless game. I mean, you join a rune cult, okay. But the way that is structured, I think, again, is another influence of RuneQuest on Tweet and his thinking.
Yeah, but they still brought that in, though. I believe it's in Unearthed Arcana, you have like an archetype, but it's largely you can build classes from different, not classes. You can build your character from different features of other classes, and so like it did eventually come through. I think one of the big differences that you just hit on between playing and as specifically as a player, old school D&D versus contemporary D&D, is I find that a lot of times when I'm playing contemporary D&D, I'm playing my mechanics. Like I'm looking at feats and I'm playing those mechanics in order to better play the concept of my character. But I definitely think that you engage with the game more in a mechanical way than you would in 1974 white box D&D or BX or even AD&D, though I still think that it, while harder to do, you can still kind of get to that point with dual classing and multi-classing,
which is a pretty distinct way of approaching things from, say, there's an Ed Greenwood article in The Dragon around 1980-81 that's called "Players Don't Need to Know the Rules." It really just explains how you shouldn't need to understand your character. You should need to know you bleed easy. Like, you can run fast, and like now just go. And he looked at this as a way to get people introduced to the game, at least initially. But there was a vision in early D&D, I think, that was so divorced from having to understand the mechanics of the game that today it wouldn't seem like contemporary D&D to us if you didn't know like your stats.
So I have a question for Courtney.
Yes.
As someone who's played a little bit of 5e and quite a bit of old school, do you see a difference in your approach, or does it all kind of bleed together?
It's all kind of the same to me. Like, I just play whatever character I'm playing and make decisions based off, as far as like character creation, and 5e has so many rules and basic doesn't. I think it takes longer to get going, but I guess I don't know the rules in detail to know. I just make a decision based off of like what the DM asks me. Like, okay, so what about this about your character? Okay, well, I think my character is more this way or that way. But no, I just enjoy playing, and I don't really care which rule set. I play whichever one everyone else wants to play. So I think I'm pretty easy going as far as that goes.
Yeah, Cornish is yeah.
I'm
down to be a dwarf.
Well, yeah, I run various versions of D&D for my homeschool game group back before the dark times, and
before the boom booms.
and they played 5e, they've played Swords and Wizardry, they've played BX D&D, and I there are some of them that I don't think even know that we're playing different games when we're playing them. You know what I mean? Like, it's all D&D to them. So
That's
I
the
think
goal for me.
Well, certainly, and I think some of this only exists when we view it under a microscope. Some of these types of discussions, and while they're fun to have, I don't necessarily think that there's as much intrinsic butting of heads of these different versions of the game as we kind of see when we look at them. And I think there's also people who are probably still playing AD&D who don't even know what the OSR is or care what the OSR is. You know what I mean? They're just happily playing AD&D with their friends, and it's not even on their radar.
And this is one of the difficulties of trying to recreate old school gaming. I mean, I think we do either we take Holmes, we take BX, we take AD&D, and when you go back to the white boxes, then right and play. I mean, we just import so many of the assumptions of much more thoroughly codified games with clear practices around things like how combat's resolved and things like that, and we bring that back into our experience. It's hard to recapture, the vertiginous terror of looking at the original box set and having to just figure out what you're going to do with it.
Mm-hmm. We'll never be able to live in that moment of time where the frontier had yet to be explored, I think is kind of what you're saying. Like,
sure. Yeah. And I mean, if you talk to, Mike Bernard would be scoffing at me now and saying, oh, come on, we all knew how to do it. We just did it. And of course, if you're Mike Bernard, I'm sure that's true. If you're like part of, the Greyhawk and Blackmore family, I'm sure there was no ambiguity about what you're supposed to do when you approach the game. But, pick some poor sucker in Los Angeles who, orders this box set in March of 1974 and is trying to figure out what to make of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do think that between the oldest versions of D&D and the newest versions is that, the clarification, because you could pick up a 5e box and you have the benefit of having 40 years of D&D design experience for what makes a good introductory product. Whereas if you were to, the guy in 1974 picking up this box for this new game, in both these instances, they could have never heard of D&D, never heard of a playing game, only have ever played, Cops and Robbers as a kid. But they're going to have an easier time with that 5th edition box set than they are with the original box set.
And I'd point to things like B1. I mean, I think B1 was maybe the first real attempt, more so even than Holmes Basic, to sit down and say, here's what you do. You're going to tell the players this is where you are, and they're going to tell you, I want to do this, and you're going to say, okay, this is what happens. Like, there isn't a lot of stuff that explains that before B1.
Yeah, we did a review of B1 recently, and that was one of the best aspects of B1 in my opinion. Was this is the tool that sits down and goes, here's how you play D&D. Whereas I don't think that the rule books necessarily did as good a job.
Well, and you can thank Mike Carr for not being a big D&D fan, in the sense of, he really approached it from how would I explain to somebody how to do this, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, obviously he'd been around this environment, and so he understood the game very well, but he wasn't, all in on it the way that some of the people in his circle were. And so I think his distance from it really helped him to explain it in a way that got new players on board.
I think we can take some comfort in looking at this and seeing that, like, how is 5e different from old school, or even how is 3 different from old school, and how is what is the old school experience. We could take some comfort in knowing that for some people that line was drawn in 1975, when they introduced Greyhawk, and they're like, this is no longer the experience I want. There's thieves now, and now everything's we're just gonna roll dice to see what happens, and it's just nice to know that's that spirit of like, you've ruined my game. It goes back to the first year of its release.
I mean, really AD&D, though, just because of that influx of players, because suddenly these were selling hundreds of thousands of copies. I think that was the point when the real battle lines were drawn. And you can draw, I think, if we're looking for what the boundaries are around old school. I look at them there anyway. That's really what I think is kind of before AD&D came along, and not just because of what AD&D said, but because of what it caused in the community. The schism, the active kind of gnashing of teeth about it that started once suddenly the game was going to be completely codified. Not that it was, but just the threat that it was.
So do you guys think that OSR exceptionalism actually starts in 1977? That sort of the game was played differently before this thing came out.
I think there's a reasonable argument to be made.
I will say that I feel like my interactions with OD&D and basic D&D players has been a lot different from my interactions with advanced Dungeons and Dragons players, and a lot of that has to do, I think, with the way the game must be played in the eyes of the advanced Dungeons and Dragons players. But as an overall fan base, the AD&D fan versus the basic D&D fan, now we're just getting into all kinds of troublemaking. I do think the fan base of AD&D is a little bit more stringent, and maybe that's where this kind of conversation loops around on itself. Maybe we're not necessarily just talking about what is old school to the OSR as a whole, but what's where those experiences come from that define what old school is to them. And maybe it's the people who were playing BX and BECME just have a very different approach and very different experience than those who were playing AD&D, albeit 1E or 2E.
There's probably something to that. I mean, there is a certain amount of continuity that runs through from OD&D to Holmes Basic to BX to BECME. I could see that.
I'm having like a flashback of the time on Critical Wits when Tim and I tried to pin down what exactly a class is in D&D, and we just ended up with more questions than answers after the hour and a half.
So I'm a spirit of confusion. I'm a spirit of ambiguity, and it's complicated. And so any discussion you bring me into, I win if the answer is it's complicated. But no, I really do in this instance think it's complicated. I mean, I think we've talked about a lot of the things that are most salient to this in terms of, how you try to draw boundaries around what's old school, what we think some of the practices were. And, I guess I'm of the opinion that the immense diversity of the things that were old school really does make it hard to nail down any originalist philosophy that we could try to recapture. I mean, I guess that's the, maybe the Achilles heel of any attempt to say we're going to do this the old school way, is that there's just so many ways to do it that can include almost anything.
Mm-hmm. There is not actually an old school way. Yeah. I also am. I'm with you. Like, I feel like we brought up a lot of good talking points, and I'm interested to hear what people have to say. If you want to write us in at questions@saberdie.info, send us an email. We'll read it on the show. I definitely came into this conversation being like, well, of course, old school play is different. But even in just the 2 years that we've been talking about doing the show with you, Carl and I have broached the subject like gingerly at times, and I'm not sure is an old school way because of how just infinitely creative D&D is, and so many things that people can do with it, because it's not, you can't account for all instances of human creativity. So yeah, it's complicated.
I think there's something that happens in the lifetime of any gamer in their gaming activity where they stop thinking about the individual game or the rules in front of them, and they start thinking about the experience of playing the game. And maybe some people will never reach that, but I mean, once you start thinking about the experience of playing the game, then you start asking these questions of like, why do I enjoy this game and not that game, and what happened at that table that made that so stupendous for me that I don't feel every time I play the game. And we're all kind of chasing this perfect experience. I think once you've had that one high of a really, really good RPG, you continue to chase it, and you continue to try to find that really and the good news is sometimes you do. Sometimes no matter how long you've been playing, you still find that moment of like, man, I am zoned in. This is very interesting. What's going to happen next? And I think the spirit of the OSR is about boiling that down, trying to channel that experience of that perfect game. And what that means to people, and what even the old school experience means to people, depends as much upon them as anything else.
Well, and this is the real explanatory power of Glenn Blacow's model, right? This idea that there's role playing, there's storytelling, there's wargaming, there's power gaming, and all those things probably need to exist to some degree in any game for it to be successful. But finding the right forms, the right alchemical combination of those things to hit your sweet spot was kind of one of the first, I think, real insights into why it is some games satisfy us more than others, and that even that was a pretty old school concept, right? That it was around by 1980, and there are things that prefigure it a bit that go back to even like 77, but like that fundamental realization that not everybody likes it the same way, and that you should be able to kind of optimize the forms of a campaign to suit the people sitting around the table. That's maybe the most old school thing of all.
I think for me, the thing that makes old school and contemporary D&D different is in old school D&D, I never have to add 37 to something. It's the thing I did for way too long, and I refuse to do anymore. Courtney, what do you think about all this as like the outside observer of like the weird geek lunch table talking about D&D?
All right, I feel like it's splitting hairs. I mean, throwing a good old Southern saying. I just feel like it's very nitpicky. Like y'all were saying, like play the game, find what you're gonna have an amazing experience sometimes when you hit all those different elements that you need for a perfect game for your game type, and you're not going to every time. Doesn't mean you're not gonna have fun in that game. It just may not feel like that perfect game. I guess go out and play D&D and have fun. And every now and then you hit that kind of perfect euphoric experience where you have all the different elements that you enjoy personally in a game. So the first North Texas convention that we went to during a break of a game, this was before I knew more about the different types of editions of Dungeons and Dragons. And we were playing in a Frank Mincer game, and so during a break, I went outside, like, just to see if it was daylight outside or not, because you kind of lose awareness of time.
Yeah.
And he asked me what type of game I like to play or something like that, and I was like, D&D. And, like, kind of knew that was maybe not the exact right answer, but also knew that it answered the question, and then that was pretty much all of the conversation. And then I waited a moment, and I think he was talking to some other people, so I like turned around and left. And I remember telling Carl about it. I was like, I'm not really sure that was the answer he wanted, but it was the best answer I had, so that's what I gave. And so then kind of the more we get into talking about the details of stuff, I'm like, that's kind of still my answer. Like, that's the game I want to play. I want to play D&D or Castles and Crusades, that game type of RPG game. And I don't really care to get into the, is it BX or is it old school or is it 5e or is it whatever. Like, I just want to play whatever everybody else wants to play in order to gather with friends or new friends and play games. So, there you go. There's my story.
I get you.
It's good stuff.
So just go play D&D.
All right. Well, again, we just want to thank Jon Peterson, author of Playing at the World, for being on the show on this episode.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks for having me. I'll come back sometime.
Oh,
Good
well,
luck.
let's go. We've got a couple emails, and then I think we'll let everybody go.
All right.
you have
Yes,
emails today.
I do. So we got an email with the subject Carl's joke from Keith. He said, I just left the show notes blank for the audience to fill in on their own. That was hilarious. Thank you, Keith, for
There's no
boosting Carl's
reason we
ego.
actually had to read that, but I demanded we did.
Especially because if I think we're going to read the other email that we have,
Yeah, this is
this is wrong again.
No. I'm right again.
No, you're wrong.
Hold on. First of all, let's not just skip over this fact that I'm hilarious.
All right.
Thank you, Keith,
Dang.
so much.
You saw right through my ploy.
Thank you, Keith, so much for writing it. That's you're not the only one who said that. Someone said it should win an award, a prestigious one. That's what they said. That's what they said on the Facebook comments. So I appreciate everybody appreciating the humor that just went right over my co-host heads.
It was very funny in retrospect.
That's the only way I am funny. All right, next email.
All right. So this email was entitled Torches from Mr. Chris Holmes. He wrote, in a recent episode, Carl and Crispy got into an entertaining argument about dropped torches. I was just reading The Scarlet Citadel by Robert E. Howard. In the story, Conan runs through a dungeon, trips and drops his torch, extinguishing it. The interesting part is later in the story, he sees its ember and blows on it to reignite it. Whenever in doubt, I always go with the great writers.
I'm gonna have to read that story because I wonder if the dungeon that he's running through, if it's particularly wet, or if maybe he drops it by a water source. Because I'm pretty sure now we've gotten several emails that state that I was right about this.
Well, Robert
Carl
E.
was
Howard agrees with me.
But he doesn't though.
I think the only way to test this is to light a torch and run down the street.
And then drop it.
And then drop it and see what happens.
Well, what's the conditions of this? Like, does the Scarlet Citadel take place, in one of the southern kingdoms that are by a river basin, or maybe it's somewhere that's wet. That's all I'm saying is I gotta get a description.
Well, that's my point. We can test it in different environments.
So Chris Holmes, thank you so much for the email, brings up a huge topic of vast discussion that we're not going to have time to get into, which is, are we simulating real life or are we simulating narrative? And in the narrative, if you drop the torch and it extinguishes, just like if you shoot the car and it explodes, is that fine to simulate in your gameplay, even though in real life, that's not really how it happens?
Oof. All right. Yeah, I guess we did kind of touch upon that with when John was talking about saving throws.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the reason you get a saving throw is because you're Conan.
And the reason the torch goes out is because it's narratively interesting.
Sure. That's like Stan Lee's quote. Spider-Man only runs out of web fluid when it's the worst time that he could run out of web fluid.
Right. And the torch only goes out when there's skeletons around.
All right.
I think the real question is this real life or is this just fantasy?
Oh, that's so good.
Wow. That was the perfect timing for that.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks for writing into the show, Chris Holmes. Yeah, I don't know though. Like, I still think Carl's wrong. Anyways, that'll be our show for this week. If you guys have you can write us in at questions@saverdie.info. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at the Save or Die Podcast. And I think that'll be it for this week. Make sure you guys stay tuned after the credits for our actual play segment.
Bye. Thank you so much for listening.
Peace out, Cub Scout.
There it is.
Are you enjoying the show you're listening to right now? Great! Why not head over to patreon.com/WGP and support that show for as little as $1 a month. $1 a month goes a long way to helping support the network of Wild Games Productions. Again, that's patreon.com/WGP. Thank you.
So you like AD&D 2nd Edition but no podcast to listen to?
Guess what?
We got the cure right here.
I got a fever. And the only prescription is
The Thaco's Hammer Podcast.
You want me to put the hammer down?
Join DMs Glenn, Brian, Corey, and Full On Gamer as they discuss, debate, and review the world of 2nd Edition AD.
Yes. Go here.
Give me a gin.
Yeah, that's DM Corey ordering drinks.
Sorry, girlfriend's getting gin.
Rules, modules, supplements, clones, everything 2E is fair game.
Someone lied to you, and there's an opposed roll, and they won, so you believe the lie. I know, but I don't, because I, the player, know that they lied to me. But you, the character, have to act like you take the lie.
So listen into a podcast where number 2 is number 1. The Thaco's Hammer Podcast, the best damn 2nd Edition AD&D podcast ever. You'll find it on iTunes or at thacoshammer.info.
In a circular room with a dead snake and a dead yawn stands Hilda and Leothward. Hilda stands ready at the base of a spiral staircase. She is with 2 mercenaries, Brother Bowen and Eric. On the staircase stands Leothward with his bow and arrow drawn. And at the top of the staircase, opening a trapdoor, is Cooper, leader of the Red Shields. As the trapdoor swings open, Cooper looks up, looks at Leothward, and says, "Nothing happened."
I have a bad feeling about this.
Peek your head out.
Can you see into the door beyond?
Yeah, it looks real nice.
Is it
It's a
grass
building.
or a room? Oh.
It's a room. It's a building. There's a fireplace. Some chairs. It's like a.
Is there a fire?
No, not currently.
Do you hear anything?
Vaguely.
What does it sound like? People?
Yeah, sounds like Manubria. Like the city.
I'm gonna move a little bit closer.
Okay, you move a little bit closer.
Can I also make out what's beyond the opening?
Sure, you by that token, you move a lot closer. You move right up there with him. Okay. And you look, and you also see a fireplace. You see this looks like kind of a nice dwelling. And you see within this dwelling, there are more spiral staircases that lead further up to another trapdoor. And there is a doorway that is currently open. And as you peer and look, it is leading out to the cities of Manubria.
So we're in like somebody's house?
Indeed.
Should we go in? What do you think, Leothard?
Are you asking me? Sorry.
I mean, I can ask the DM, but I don't know that he'll tell us.
I want to look around, so I'll go up through the trapdoor.
Okay.
Into this person's house, I guess.
Sure.
What's the room I'm standing in look like?
You're standing in a circular room. It's about the same dimensions as the room you just came up from. There is a door that is open, and there is a trap door in the ceiling, just like the one you came through, that is also open.
Are we in a tower? Do we know we're in a tower?
I mean, we're in the Tower of Xenopus.
Well, no, the Tower of Xenopus is a pile of ruins, and you went down through that pile of ruins into this dungeon that was located underneath the Tower of Xenopus. And your travels have apparently led you back into town, because now you are standing in a building inside the city of Manubria.
But you said there's a trapdoor next to me that I just came out of that's open. And then in the ceiling, there's also a trapdoor that's open?
And another spiral staircase, much like the one you came up, that is leading up.
Are we in a Tower of Xenopus museum? It's like a rebuild in the middle of town or something.
The other spiral staircase, is that accessible from this room?
Yes.
I'm going to relay this information to everyone. Oh, are there any other exits on this floor? Like, we can hear the town.
There's a door that's open that leads to the streets of Manubria.
Okay. I'm going to, tell everyone that, like, we somehow ended up back in town, and there's another staircase that we could go up.
Crispy, roll a d6. You want to roll a low number.
I rolled a 1.
Interesting. You hear from up above you, on what would be the second floor, sounds of a grunting animal.
Oh.
Cooper asks you, what's the matter?
I'm going to tell... there's some sort of beast above us.
Can I go up closer to them? Are we all up there?
Yeah, you can go up there.
Okay. I just want to be close enough to be
helpful.
Yeah.
As you're standing there pondering what to do, you start hearing the clanging of metal accompanying this grunting beast. And just clang, clang, clang. I don't have good clanging Foley work. Hold on, ready? That does not sound right. I tried.
That's all right. I think I'm going to drop back down the hole.
Okay, you go back down.
And then I'm just going to keep a lookout to see what comes down the spiral staircase.
Is he shutting the door?
No, I'm keeping it open.
Oh, okay.
So, you drop back down onto the staircase in the dungeons, and you peek up through the trap door, and you look trying to look up at the other staircase, and it's a little bit hard, but you're able to get a pretty good line of sight, and nothing comes down.
I'm gonna tell everyone that I heard something up above us, and but like there is a safe exit, and I'm gonna suggest that we go back into the room quietly.
Cooper pauses and says, "What do you think this all means? What is this?"
I don't know. It's odd that didn't we have to travel quite a ways to get to the tower? It wasn't just outside of town, was it? Like, so much so that if we went through the basement, we wouldn't have ended up back in town, right?
I don't know that we specified, but no, it was you. The dungeon's pretty large, and you've actually done quite a bit of traveling as it is. So you weren't too far out of town, and it doesn't defy logic for you to be back here. In the sample dungeon, it's just the ruin. The entrance is in town.
Okay.
So I kind of shifted a little bit and then shifted it back a little bit.
I'm just gonna explain that we found a shortcut. We found an alternate entrance. If we could clear this out, we might have an easier way to get back to explore more. But there's something above us that might prove to make that difficult.
Okay, but is this just someone's house?
Could I tell fairly clearly that the grunting noises were not of a man?
Yeah, I'll say yeah.
And it's not like a common animal or anything. It wasn't like somebody's like...
Despite your amazing
my amazing animal impression.
And it didn't sound like a dog or like somebody's like pet of some sort, right?
No, not really. No, I wouldn't say that's the impression you got.
Oh, then I'll say to Coop, it very well could be someone's home, or was, and now it has been absconded with by squatters. Perhaps if we can rid them of their whatever that is problem, there might be a handsome reward in it for us.
Onward to treasure.
What do you think, Hilda? Do you think we should go into this person's house and try to explore it, or should I'm a little hesitant. I feel like maybe we should just stick to the dungeons and leave well enough alone.
Oh, somebody could use our help. And there might be a reward.
And if we do manage to find treasure in the dungeon, this would be a fair, easy way to get into town to unload that treasure.
Well, we'll go with you, whatever you decide.
All right. So I'm going to try to coax us in quietly into the room above us.
Okay, you are all standing inside a circular room. There is a circular stairway leading up to a trapdoor in the ceiling. There's a trapdoor in the floor that you're standing around, and there is a wide open door that leads to the city streets of Manubria.
Oh, the door to Manubria is open?
Yes, they're both open.
Oh, okay. I'm going to peek out the door to Manubria. Like, can I tell kind of where we are-ish? Is there activity on the street?
Yeah, there's some activity, and you kind of peek out the door, and you notice that you're in a tower.
Is there a sign out there that says Xenopus Museum?
It does not say Xenopus Museum. It looks to be a private dwelling, and it doesn't look that different from Finian's Tower, the wizard who sent you on this quest, but it's definitely not Finian's Tower.
But it could be another wizard's tower. Maybe. I don't know.
Yes, it could be. It very likely is. And Cooper kind of laments for a second. He's like, I wish we had Jon with us still. He was a local. He might know about this.
We still have Cooper, Eric, and Brother Bowen, right?
Right.
In addition to Hilda and myself?
Right. And Jon was a new recruit of theirs who was local to this town. But they are not.
I think that we should have Eric go check the other door.
All right. At this point, Cooper says, how about you go check it?
I can go check it.
Hilda, you're expendable. Eric isn't. If anything, if he were at a party and was playing a game in which he had to introduce himself by saying an adjective that begins with the same letter as his name, and then his name, he would be expendable Eric.
And I would be
heroic Hilda.
As I often say.
How about we don't get ourselves killed, Hilda?
And you would be
I'm always lazy Leothard.
not lively Leothard.
Oh, that's a good one. I should have come up with that.
Dead Leothard. Eric, if you go up first, I'll be right behind you to protect you.
Well, Eric's not too worried about going up there at all, but Cooper's a little hesitant. But Cooper will say, as long as more than just Eric's going up, I don't mind pulling our weight, as long as you're pulling your weight.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay. So, Cooper and Hilda ascend the staircase to the second trapdoor. And what are you doing? Are you going to peer through it? Are you going to just go up into it? How do you want to approach it?
Do I hear anything at the door?
We hear that same grunting sound and the clanging of metal.
I am going to train my bow on the door.
Can Eric peek? Does the door open towards us or away from us?
Yes, it opens and it's hanging down.
Oh, it's already open.
Yes.
Sorry. All right. Can we see anything?
You peer through the hole.
Peek.
You
yes.
peek and peer. You peek.
Whatever's littler. I want to do the littlest looking I can.
You squint. You squint through the hole. Oh, goodness. Okay. You peek through the trapdoor, and the room above you also has a spiral staircase, also leading up to a closed trapdoor. This is very clearly some sort of magical study. You see, even to your dwarf eyes, the looks of arcane artifacts littering this room. And in a large cage stands a giant, hostile and angry-looking ape, grunting and shaking the cage. That didn't sound any better.
Does he look like rabid or possessed, or does he just look like an ape that's angry because it's in a cage? Probably
Yeah, it
too
just looks
small.
like an angry ape in a cage. He doesn't look demonic or anything like that. He doesn't look like a monster. Just look like an angry monkey in a cage. I know they're not actually monkeys.
Oh, so like wait, so all right.
Do I have a banana?
Well, now we're just in some wizard's house.
Yes, you are in a wizard's house.
It's weird that the door was open. It means the wizard might know that, like, I'm sure the wizard is aware that his house is upon, like, it's above the ruins of the Tower of Xenopus. Or the dungeon underneath.
It's like the wizard left in a hurry.
Maybe. Like,
is there any, like, disheveled papers?
There is, now that you see that the ape is caged and there doesn't seem to be any immediate danger, you're able to look around a little bit more thoroughly. There are tall windows on each of the wall, and there are 2 giant tomes, giant books that look magical in nature. There are lamps and Bunsen burners and chemicals and skulls and loose pieces of parchment. There's mystical designs written on the floor. Real proper wizard study type place. Eric at this point says, "Hey, do you think one of those books is the Book of Xenopus that Finian wanted?"
is that what we're trying to find? Oh, yeah. Maybe, but like, I don't want to straight up rob this dude. Like, I don't know. I for one would rather not rob a wizard.
Sounds like a poor decision.
Yeah.
Well, we're all standing in
to rob the wizard.
Cooper says, "Well, we're all standing in his house. Do you think we should go back down?"
I think that we should go and alert the guards that this man left his house, and he left his door open.
Are the Bunsen burners still on? Like, were things left?
No, they're not. Nothing is currently percolating. The fire's out. Everything's.
What happens if I throw some food at the monkey? Like, give the ape some food? Do I have anything an ape would eat?
Sure, you have some, like, almonds or something that you can throw its way.
Can I get them in the cage? Like, kind of toss them in the cage?
Sure.
The monkey can just get to them?
I understand. You're not...
They're different.
Ape, sorry.
We know. It's a manubrium ape monkey, so it can be whatever we want it to be.
Oh, it's a gorilla, but it has a tail.
Yeah. Hilda approaches the cage and tosses some almonds at the feet of this large beast. It immediately bends down and picks up the food and starts nibbling on it. It seemingly calms down during this time of feasting. It's no longer making lots of noise, and you are in the second floor. I want both of you to roll a d6. You want a low number.
Well, I rolled a 6.
Dose.
You rolled a 2?
I did.
Leothward, you hear from down in the dungeon the voice of 2 people having a conversation. One voice says, "We cannot delay. I must get back to my books." And another voice says, "Of course, sir. Excellent, sir." What do you do?
I feel like honesty is probably going to be the... I mean, I tell everyone that I hear a noise. But I feel like hiding would be... I mean, is there even anywhere to hide in this area?
There is an open doorway out to the city. You hear this all the way in the dungeon.
Do we grab the book and go?
Well, we don't know that these are the books of Xenopus.
We grab both the books and go? All right, remind me, who are we getting the books for?
Finian wants the book of Xenopus. He'll reward you for the book. Any other treasure you find in the dungeon is yours as well.
Do we want to do it without just grabbing the books and running?
I don't know if these are the books though. Like,
I mean, if they're not, we leave them on the doorstep and knock and run. Then he has his books back.
that's true. They don't have like forensics. They're not going to be able to dust it for prints.
You hear the voices of these two people in the dungeon. One's muttering about how I must get back to my books. I got to do my studying. And the other one's just absolutely drooling over every word this other person says. Like, absolutely, sir. Of course you must, sir. That's where we're going to stop for this actual play. And we'll see how Hilda and Leothward and the Red Shields get out of this at this point.
The Save or Die podcast is a production of Wild Games Production, and it's produced for entertainment purposes only. The music used in the intro and outro is by Tripod and used with permission. Be sure to visit the Save or Die crew at saveordie.info for more information. If you'd like to support this podcast, please go to patreon.com/WGP.
Laugh at me, that's nothing new. Who's